Hi guys, welcome back. Let's start talking about mitochondria. So here is the overview of one mitochondrion. So like the chloroplast, you need to understand what the structure of the mitochondrion is. You need to be able to recognize it on a diagram like this and also on an electron micrograph. So you need to identify where each one of the stages of cellular respiration happens. The reason that I'm doing this after glycolysis is because glycolysis does not happen in the mitochondrion. Glycolysis happens in the cytosol of the cell. So you don't need a mitochondrion to have glycolysis happen. So let's have a look at the structure of one of these right now. So first thing I like to notice here is that we have not one, but two membranes. Okay, so that's really important to remember that we have two membranes with the mitochondrion. The outer membrane is kind of smooth, like a vesicle, like it's being formed around the outside. And the inner mitochondrion has got, the inner membrane has got all of these folds. Okay, and those folds, these inner membrane, they're called cristae. So the cristae are the folds within that mitochondrion. You'll also notice that there is this intermembrane space here. All right, and that's because stuff is going to move in between the intermembrane space and the inside of the mitochondrion here, so the inside of the inner membrane. So that inside of the inner membrane is called the matrix. Yeah, not like the movie, but this is inside the inner membrane. Now within this, there's a whole bunch of interesting bits and pieces. So one of the really interesting things is that they, like the chloroplasts, have their own DNA, and that's called mitochondrial DNA. We come back to mitochondrial DNA in Unit 4 again, but for now we're just going to say they have DNA. The other thing that they tend to have is they have their own ribosomes. Yep, and then this guy here, Atp Synthase. Atp Synthase. So if we're talking about an ASE, what does that mean? It is an enzyme. It's in its name as well. What do you reckon it does? ATP synth. Okay, so enzyme that synthesizes or makes ATP. Okay, so there is our basic structure of a mitochondrion. You might want to pause here, make sure you draw one on your booklet. Here are two more pictures. You can see I've given you another one here that's a bit bigger that shows really easily. You can see here is the mitochondrial DNA. You can see there's lots of ribosomes still. The matrix is inside that inner membrane. Here is your inner membrane. Here is your outer membrane. Your inner membrane is still called the cristae. And then you've got here's the cristae. So cristae technically refers to all of the folds, like the points of the folds, but you can get away with calling the inner membrane the cristae as well here. And then all embedded in here, these little guys here, these little red or brownish kind of creatures, that's the ATP synthase in this diagram. So that's two different diagrams showing you the structure of a mitochondrion. This next section is almost exactly the same as the bit that we did to do with endosymbiosis of chloroplasts. So mitochondria were also, once upon a time, a bacterium. So this is this would be the original mitochondrion down here, is this little bacterium. Now what we think happened is they got engulfed. And you can see this is what's happening. So the vesicle, they get engulfed into a vesicle. That vesicle is going to become the outer mitochondrial membrane over here in this third picture. And the inside membrane, which was the outside of the bacterial plasma membrane, that becomes all infolded, and there you go. There's your cristae. And we found that we think this is the case because they lived in a nice symbiotic relationship. They were each getting something out of this. So here's another example of the order in which we think these things happened. So there were these ancestral prokaryotes. So this is the one that kind of looked like a mitochondrion. There was another one that kind of looked like a chloroplast over here. And we think that the very first thing that happened was that there was one of these cells. So this is the cell number 1. over here. And we think the first thing it started to do, at number 2 over here, was develop its own nuclear envelope. After it developed its nuclear envelope, it went, oh, it's much nicer if we kind of sort all of our DNA into one spot. Let's see what else we can do. And so what happened was one of these ancestral prokaryotes got engulfed, and that was the mitochondria. So we think mitochondria came first. I'm going to put it to you in a second. Why do you think the mitochondria came first? Okay, then after the mitochondria was engulfed, some of those cells went, oh, great, this is great. I'm getting all this ATP now. This is a nice, good symbiotic relationship. I can give this mitochondria glucose. The mitochondria can give me ATP. I get to grow bigger. I get to grow more cells. I can become multicellular. All of these things stem from this one little bacteria engulfed by another bigger bacteria. After that, some of those eukaryotic cells may have engulfed the chloroplast. So the biggest thing I want to say with this picture is that the mitochondria were first and the chloroplasts were second. And I'll show you why in a second, why that's the case. So here's a good diagram showing us why we think mitochondria came first. This is a phylogenetic tree. We'll come back to them in Unit 4. You can see that here is our oldest common ancestor down the bottom. So here's our old common ancestor. Over here we've got archaea, we've got bacteria, they're the prokaryotes. They branched off a really long time ago. And then we've got the eukaryotes over on this side. And we think that the mitochondria were engulfed first because we find them in all 3 of these kingdoms. We find them in animals, we find them in fungi, we find them in plants. However, the chloroplasts, which were also engulfed, we only find those guys in the plants. So the chloroplasts were engulfed as well, like we learned, but they must have been engulfed after the mitochondria because plants have both. They have both mitochondria and they have chloroplasts. So when you're thinking about writing an answer to the question as to what the evidence is that a mitochondria used to be a bacterium, is you need to say what they have in common. Okay, so the biggest thing they have in common is they've both got DNA. Okay, and what that DNA has in the mitochondria, so you can say mtDNA, you don't have to write, you can write mtDNA or you can just write DNA. Is we found that mtDNA has instructions for proteins that the mitochondria need. So one of the proteins that the mitochondria need, if you can think about it, it has the instructions for how to make ATP synthase, which makes sense because that's within the mitochondria. We also need to use this in Unit 4 when we talk about establishing evolutionary relationships, but we'll come back to that. The other thing that they have is they have ribosomes. Again, you're going to need ribosomes if you're going to make your own proteins. We also find that mitochondria can reproduce on their own, regardless of the cell reproducing, and they reproduce in a very similar way to bacteria by a process called binary fission. You could also say that they both have DNA similarities, so they have very similar DNA. If you want to remember, this one's pretty far out there, but they both have little membrane pore ends that look the same as bacteria ones. Also, you've got 2 membranes. If you've got 2 membranes, that indicates that they were engulfed. Okay. So 2 membranes indicate they're engulfed, and all of these things suggest that the prokaryotes and the mitochondria had a common ancestor.